Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. My name is Siviwe Mhlana, and I'm the project lead for the Sustainable and Inclusive Recovery Project at the Wits Southern Center for Inequality Studies. It is an honor to welcome you to our first session of the Post-COVID Economic Recovery Learning Series, a collaboration with the Ford Foundation's Plus Fund Initiative for Economic Recovery. Before we begin, I will be taking you through some of the background of this collaboration and the early research which has informed much of the aims of this initiative, before ending off with an overview of the agenda for this first learning session, as well as the key questions that we hope to answer. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic is an ongoing global health crisis, as well as an economic and social one. It has brought into sharp focus the structural failings of the global economy, particularly on those in the global south, living in precarity and suffering the worst impacts of the climate crisis. There is a risk that the pandemic will reverse the incremental gains made over the past several years to meaningfully reduce poverty, encourage deeper climate financing, advance human rights, and achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The long-term implications of this ongoing global health and economic crisis, coupled with existing structural failures in global finance, debt, and climate, are profound for the hundreds of millions living in the global south. Against this backdrop, in 2020, SCIS, together with the Ford Foundation's Plus Fund Initiative for Economic Recovery, embarked on a collaborative project to position the perspectives of activists, experts, and indigenous communities in the global south in international policy discussions about a post-COVID-19 economic recovery. The aim of the collaboration was to ensure that prevailing global and regional policy discussions on the crisis advanced alternative and credible policy proposals that were more socially just, centered the priorities and interests of the global south, and maximized prospects of reducing structural inequalities around the world. At the start of the project, we conducted a landscape analysis to determine the extent to which recovery policy proposals at the time reflected issues concerning the global south, and also to determine the kinds of policies that were required to save lives, protect livelihoods, and address the multiple challenges that had been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. The findings revealed that there was a fundamental disconnect between what was being recommended at the international level and the experiences of communities and economies in these contexts. Key informant interviews with activists, civil society organizations, policymakers in the global south revealed 6 common issues facing developing countries. These included poverty, inequality, precarity, climate change, insufficient access to social protections and social services, and a constrained fiscal space. Furthermore, persistent colonial legacies and the unequal inclusion of Southern countries in the global financial system pose significant limitations on the resources that developing countries had to adequately respond to the multiple crises that had been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. The study also showed significant gaps in mainstream policy recommendations for economic recovery, particularly how and where these policies positioned women, informal workers, indigenous communities in the functioning of the global economic system, thus highlighting the need for alternative visions for a post-COVID-19 economic recovery that was rooted in the experiences of communities and economies in the global south, and which centered the role of women and indigenous communities in the structuring of the global economic system. Now, 3 years into the recovery, the Post-COVID Economic Recovery Learning Series offers an ideal opportunity for social movements, civil society organizations, policymakers, and experts from the global south to learn and share knowledge about the key learnings, challenges, and strategies for achieving an inclusive and sustainable recovery. The overarching objective of this learning series is to influence the international development policy discourse based on the experiences of economies and countries in the global south, and to dismantle narratives that have historically deprived communities of the necessary resources for addressing the multiple social and economic challenges that they face. This first learning session, titled Dismantling Power Asymmetries in the Global Financial Infrastructure, Pathways Towards a Democratic and Economically Just Recovery, is the first of 3 learning sessions to be hosted by the Southern Center for Inequality Studies between April and June 2023. Our next learning session will be held on the 25th of May, 2023, as an online virtual convening similar to this one. This first learning session seeks to answer the following questions. 1, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected the social and economic landscape of countries in the Global South? For example, economic growth, public finance, poverty and inequality, gender equality, and employment. 2, what are the gaps between what is being discussed at the international level and the reality of what communities are experiencing on the ground? 3, what are the challenges and opportunities for transforming the current global financial infrastructure towards an equitable and sustainable economy for all? It is an honor to present our speakers for this first learning session. Dr. Gilad Isaacs will be presenting on the challenges and opportunities for a new global financial architecture. Dr. Gilad Isaacs is the Executive Director at the Institute for Economic Justice. He is also an economist at Wits University, where he coordinates the National Minimum Wage Research Initiative and lectures. Gilad has a PhD and Master's in Economics from SOAS University of London and a Master's in Political Economy from New York University. He has worked as a consultant for the United Nations International Labour Organization and the Global Labour University. He has a background in civil society activism, working for the Treatment Action Campaign and founding the Social Justice Coalition. His research expertise are in financialization, macroeconomics, and labor markets. Dr. Rogerio Sturat will be our respondent for this session. Dr. Rogerio Sturat is a distinguished economist and senior fellow of Brazil's Center of International Relations. He also serves as a distinguished fellow at the Global Federation of Competitiveness Councils, where he focuses on initiatives to promote evidence-based policies for the necessary transition to low carbon growth. Dr. Sturat has previously held executive director roles at the World Bank Group and the Inter-American Development Bank Group, where he chaired several board committees and represented Brazil at international forums, including the G20 meetings. He has also worked for the United Nations in Santiago, Chile, Geneva, Switzerland, and the Chase Manhattan Bank of Brazil. Dr. Sturat has a PhD in economics from the University College of London, England, and is an award-winning scholar who has authored books, articles on macroeconomics, international finance, sustainable development, and op-eds in various global news and media outlets. Finally, Ms. Ghada Abdel-Tawwab will be providing the summary of the key learnings for this session, as well as chairing the discussion session. Ms. Ghada Abdel-Tawwab is a Global Senior Program Officer on the Future of Workers team, working in the Foundation's Cairo office. She leads Ford's global work on advancing worker power, social protection, and economic security. Over the past 9 years, Ghada served as Ford's program officer, focused on supporting civil society, government, and academic institutions in their efforts to promote social justice in the Middle East and North Africa, with a particular focus on decent work and social protection in the informal economy. Ghada has worked for nearly 30 years to advance the development and human rights. Before joining Ford in 2013, she was a senior regional expert at the German International Cooperation Program for the Economic Integration of Women in the Middle East and North Africa. Previously, Ghada was a senior advisor and technical team leader for gender equality at the Canadian International Development Agency. Ghada holds a master's degree in development studies and a bachelor's degree in political science, both from the American University in Cairo. I now hand over to our first speaker for this session, Dr. Gilad Isaacs. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks, Saviwe, and thanks very much to SCIS for the invitation, and Ford and other panelists. I'm conscious that the series attempts to answer both substantive political and analytical questions and to reflect on lessons we have learned in undertaking this work as part of the Ford Foundation's Plus Fund initiative. I'm going to contribute some thoughts on the question, as Saviwe said, of challenges and opportunities for transforming the global financial architecture, knowing that there are many experts here from a political and analytical point of view. whilst utilizing reflections from our work as part of a consortium of the IEJ, OTE, ERO, CEDAS, and CSR as jumping off points in this input. In thinking about this topic, three things struck me, and in looking back on some of our work. First, the question itself of transforming the global financial architecture has become very common and has a broad spectrum of support, at least in rhetoric, across role players. In this week's UN Financing for Development Forum, we saw criticism of the prevailing global financial system from organizations and from civil society movements, the IMF, World Bank, governments, feminist collectives, and a wide range of actors. We even heard the UN General Secretary say that the global financial architecture has failed countries at their moment of greatest need. Of course, not all these actors necessarily mean the same thing. Secondly, it seems that we share a relatively common set of understandings of the dysfunctions caused by the existing global financial system, the massive illicit financial flows, tax evasion, unsustainable private and multilateral debt, a looming debt crisis, private sector capture, insufficient climate finance, and so on. And of course, these manifest most acutely in the global south and disproportionately impact marginalized communities, including like women, minorities, indigenous persons, and so on. Thirdly, it also seems that there's a somewhat shared set of proposals for reforming this financial architecture, including more democratic, transparent, and accountable IFIs, increasing financing on favorable terms, the need for restructuring debt, and so on. And in fact, many of those involved in Ford's initiative are organizations working on these. So, you know, instead of sort of treading these sort of shared areas, I set myself possibly a task beyond that, which I shouldn't have, but in an attempt to say something new, or at least something which raises new questions, I wanted to think about a systemic analysis of the financial architecture, one which looks beyond the commonly shared understandings of the dysfunctions which it causes and the somewhat shared policy reforms, and to use that systemic analysis to unpack opportunities, challenges, and organizing for a change. So that's where we're going. The main example which I'd like to use in doing this is two recent crises, which I think offer a fulcrum for our conversation. In March of this year, colleagues might recall there was a run on an American bank, the Silicon Valley Bank, SVB, where depositors attempted to withdraw financing from that bank. In response, the US Federal Reserve set up a new lending facility, expanded its balance sheet by about 300 billion, and provided assurances that uninsured depositors would be made whole. And this reached beyond just SVB. As that turmoil spread across the Atlantic, we saw the impact on the Swiss bank Credit Suisse, which seemed on the edge of financial implosion. The Federal Reserve reactivated its international dollar swap lines, which provide US dollars to European allies. The Swiss authorities wrote amendments to the existing law to allow for a UBS merger and offered a publicly guaranteed backstop. So this injection of liquidity and this swift maneuvering, which we see in that crisis, finds its mirror opposite in the looming debt crisis of the developing world, in which we see at least about 52 developing countries either distressed or on the verge of being so. Now, in some ways, this is a similar crisis. These countries are not necessarily over-indebted per se. Some countries, the emerging market average debt levels is below its historic highs, and inflation might eat into that. The problem which many countries face is one of liquidity. Prohibitively high interest rates have made it difficult for these countries to access new financing or roll over existing loans. Now, the primary provider of financing in this instance is the IMF. And in contrast to the other crisis, what we've actually seen from the IMF is one, that lending is slower than it was. Two, that it is costly, with fees and surcharges being the IMF's single largest source of revenue. And three, that the IMF is overly concerned with restructuring debt in a manner which protects private creditors. So these contrasting examples, which I first read in an excellent article by Professor Mona Ali, illustrates, I think, some salient features of the global financial system and the systemic features. First of these, which I think in civil society work we sometimes emphasize less, is the manner in which the global financial architecture is established to protect the interests of private finance capital or a global financial elite through various forms of bank bailouts or ensuring that sovereign lending is repaid even if it means crippling austerity. Now, these same interests are served by other features, for instance, tax evasions, illicit like financial flows, and so on. So, the global financial architecture serves to, in an age of neoliberal, financialized, finance-led capitalism, protect the accumulation of capital and finance capital in particular. An excellent theorization of this is Gabora's Wall Street consensus, where she argues essentially that there's 10 policy tenets analogous to the Washington consensus, which essentially serve to utilize public funds to de-risk investment opportunities and create the conditions for private financial investment, in particular by large institutional investors and in areas we would traditionally consider unprofitable public goods like infrastructure. And in fact, we've seen a prime example of this in our own work in South Africa, which is the recent Just Energy Transition Partnership, a $8.5 billion financing deal between South Africa, the US, UK, Germany, and the European Union, and the associated investment plan, which is attached. And this is meant to provide South Africa with funds for decarbonizing. Now, our work reflects a number of perverse outcomes here. Firstly, that approaching climate finance in a bilateral way rather than through a transparent multilateral system entrenches global north, global south power inequities. Second, that the composition of this financing is unfavorable, with a small fraction in grants and most in a de-risking private investment framework. Third, that it reinforces a privatized or a PPP model of energy systems. Fourth, that it might worsen South Africa's fiscal position. Fifth, that it will fail to raise insufficient funds. Sixth, that energy poverty may be exacerbated through the increased cost of energy provision to secure private profit, opposed to energy as a public good. I forget what number I'm on now, but the erosion of democratic accountability, and the fact that it reinforces a capital-intensive and financialized growth path. Now, these are the obstacles and the learnings which we've seen in this work. But this is all being done in the interest of securing profitable private profitable opportunities for private investment along the lines of a Wall Street consensus. And it's important to note that this has very real material consequences. This deal leaves out, for instance, the creation of employment for those displaced from coal-reliant industries. It leaves out the offering of social security to those workers or to the communities in which they are embedded. And so the first illustration from these examples, which I'm drawing out on a systemic level, is the functioning of this architecture to secure private financial accumulation. The second is, and this is sometimes seen as a technical facet of the system, is the centrality of the US dollar, okay? In both cases of these crises, which I mentioned, liquidity was offered in US dollars. And we know that the US dollar functions as world money, as a global unit of account, i.e. to see who owes who what, as a global means of exchange to buy and sell, and as a global store of value. And it is this dollar hegemony which arguably holds and glues the global financial architecture together. Most debt, for instance, is denominated in that way, which lays the basis for balance of payments crises. Now, in line with what I was saying before, this also has a class character, and it's important to understand this in our work that works towards transforming the financial architecture towards an equitable and sustainable economy. And essentially, these pools of offshore dollars exist for two main reasons. The first is in funding trade. And in this instance, developing countries who need to build up a reserve of US dollars are often forced into a situation where they attempt to sell more into the market than they are purchasing in order to build up that US dollar surplus. This often leads to a suppression of domestic wages in order to maintain global competitiveness. The second driver of these large offshore pools is wealth inequality and outsized corporate profits, where large corporations, pension funds, wealthy individuals essentially hold dollar-denominated liquid assets in this shadow banking system. And this, whilst has legitimate purposes, also facilitates tax evasion, corruption, and so on. Okay, I don't think I'm going to go into that in detail. But what I want to emphasize here is that the utilization of the US dollar in this sense has real consequences for workers and global South countries. And often I think what's observed in the work of civil society is a focus on institutional reforms, for instance, a more democratic set of IFIs, but at the exclusion of an analysis of these other types of systemic issues within the architecture. There is currently a drive by global South governments to form a multipolar currency system. And whilst these debates of de-dollarization are extremely complex, we have indeed seen countries like China, India, Russia, and others facilitating trade and financial arrangements in other countries. We also heard President Lula, for instance, reaffirm a call for the BRICS countries to de-dollarize trade. What this means, and if it is possible, is contested, but I'm going to leave that aside. The issue here is that I think it's very important that for those of us engaging in looking and analyzing the global financial architecture to interrogate what these systemic features and contestations mean. The third lesson from my examples above relate to the functioning of this architecture. And in fact, both crises are a result of a similar set of events, or at least are in part a result of a similar set of events within that. And that in particular is the increased interest rates in the US. In the SVB case, this eroded the value of their assets in US Treasury, weakened their balance sheet. In the developing countries instance, we saw that this meant that it made new borrowing in US dollars expensive, led to pressure on currency depreciation and forced countries to use expensive reserves up to about 380 billion last year to defend currencies. And so the functioning of this architecture is playing out in a range of ways which might look like they aren't connected. The fourth lesson, and then I'm aware that my time is ticking away, is that we shouldn't overestimate the planned or fixed nature of this architecture. In fact, the system has in part evolved in an unplanned manner, with new layers being added as and when it is needed. And we see that, for instance, both in the novel actions taken in response with the banking crisis and, for instance, in the illogical absence of a multilateral framework for sovereign debt restructuring. And in fact, whilst there are powerful actors entrenched in the status quo, what this means is that the system itself is contingent. And in fact, the system has evolved, particularly during moments of crisis. The Bretton Woods system, for instance, was built in World War II. The floating exchange rates came out of the economic turmoil of the 1970s. The expansion of sovereign bond markets in the developing world followed the debt crises of the early 1980s, and new instruments like the reserve dollar swap lines emerged out of the 2007-8 financial crisis. So what we see is that conservative forces have been highly effective in using crises to construct a global financial architecture which systemically advances financial elites. And we must also think how to. So I'm going to use my last few minutes now to turn to what this means for implications for action. I've by no means covered all salient features of the global financial architecture. And what I've tried to do is point to where I think some blind spots are in the work which civil society activists, researchers are engaged. As I said at the outset, there is sometimes a common shared understanding of the dysfunctions and reforms needed. And I've tried to probe through these examples some other salient features. So I think this has 5 broad implications. And some of this comes also out of the learning exchange which our consortium undertook. The first is the need to center private finance within our analysis and as a target of our advocacy. We need to make clear the material impacts of private financial accumulation for the reality of communities experienced on the ground. An example of the potential of deepening energy poverty in the context of JETP, which I mentioned earlier, is an example. We need to interrogate how our traditional targets of advocacy, IFIs, multilateral forums, and so on, advance the interests of private finance. We need to interrogate the ways in which private finance and financial markets must be regulated. We need to think about how we target private financial institutions in our advocacy and how this integrates with other facets of our work. Secondly, we need to more deeply interrogate the systemic features and operations of the global financial system, including the role of the US dollar, the implications of this, and the resistance to it for global South countries, workers, and traditionally marginalized group. For instance, an immediate sovereign debt relief might not be lasting if developing countries are continuously forced by the prevailing system to access dollar financing and accumulate dollar reserves in order to be a participant in the global economy. Third, the critical work on institutional reforms, for example, the governance of IFIs, and the work on regulatory reform, for example, on a global tax agreement, could be more rooted in a political economy analysis of these global power relations. And I acknowledge I've only partially illustrated those. This is not to say that much of the excellent work which is being done hasn't got that, but I think we should be cautious about finding ourselves in a position where where technically sound proposals don't land and aren't effective because of these power relationships. Fourth, I think we must guard against policy proposals that might inadvertently reinforce a perverse global financial architecture. For instance, I support calls for an expanded SDR, special drawing rights issuance from the IMF, and a revision of how those are allocated. But we must also consider the position of the IMF in a dollar system with an existing system of reserve holdings, and think to ourselves what other reforms might be needed simultaneously to ensure that a policy like an expansion of SDRs is systemically transformative. And fifth, while I don't think we should engage in armchair sort of grand planning, and whilst alternative systems are often built in the process of struggle, it is worthwhile to think broadly beyond the individual or collection of policy proposals to what a fair and equitable global financial architecture might look like. This, I think, needs to occur on the level of a paradigm and in practice. In a paradigm is about a shared conceptual framework. For instance, our consortium has been thinking about a rights-based global financial architecture. In practice, this means thinking about how the excellent proposals being advanced add up to a new system, and what might be being missed from those in order to be building a new system. With those reflections, I'm going to end. As I say, I have hope I haven't skipped over a range of important manifestations of the global financial architecture, but I wanted to try and think what it means to do a deeper systemic analysis and what implications this might have. I look forward to everyone's engagement. Thanks very much.
Mario, can we invite you to come in and do your reactions before we open the floor for the conversation, please?
Thank you. I
Thank
have
you
15
very much,
minutes.
Gilad. Thank you, Gilad. Thank you so much.
I have 15 minutes, right? Is that how long you want
Yes.
me to talk? Okay,
Yes.
good.
Thank you.
Let me start by thanking you very much for this invitation, and wishing everyone good morning, good evening, whatever you are. Let me say that the presentation by Dr. Isaacs was very comprehensive. And what I'll try to do is to use a little bit, you talk a lot about the asymmetries, the historical and the present asymmetries, and I want to talk a little bit about the opportunities that may arise from the mess that we live in, okay? I think that you did an excellent job in going back and look at the roots of the asymmetries. Let me try to summarize a little bit how I see these roots. I mean, and here I'm going to focus more on the Washington-based multilateral system, but also it does illustrate a little bit about the symmetries that we have been, or their evolution reflects a little bit the symmetries in the international financial architecture that we have had. So if you look at what the system that was created after the Second World War, and think about it, it's difficult to think about something that happened 70 years ago, but think about a war that when you only had one country really that among the industrialized countries could have a role in helping reconstructing the countries around it, and at the same time reconstructing the monetary system. And we, of course, we're talking about the United States, but in a war that is falling apart, okay, or fell apart, and now you have to put the pieces together. So the principle that guided the reconstructions was very simple and very powerful. The only way, and it was built on the lessons that you had before, which is the only way to achieve a sustained peace is through shared prosperity, is making all the countries or the key countries feel that they have a part of this, of the growth and the development of the world development. And the second thing is the key is stability, particularly stability in the exchange rates systems that prevail, so that you could allow for trade to be the pillar for economic growth and shared prosperity, and at the same time guarantee that international flows of capital were useful for this reconstruction and shared prosperity. So it was a shared prosperity in a way, and stability in order to foster trade, and let's call it, the productive capital flows. That kind of principle very quickly disappeared of this conversation. Why? Because of how successful it was, the reconstructions of the key allies for the United States. Then we're talking about Germany, you're talking about Japan, and then the other key countries that benefit from that. For instance, I was born in Brazil, but the industrialization of Brazil and the creation of a solid relationship of trade with the West was seen as a successful process. So after this very short period of time, I would say 2 decades of maintaining these principles, the nature of the systems changed quite rapidly. I mean, the U.S., first of all, in 1973, the U.S., decided or move it out of convertibility, and the system became completely dollar-centric in the sense that the dollar, the U.S. holding the dollar and issuing the dollar was the basis of providing liquidity, but also stability of the whole system. And when it came to the development part, so the system had 2 parts, basically. The monetary arrangements, which is, as I said, I'm focused on the IMF, is seen as the IMF being the lender of last resort in balance of payment crisis. And you had, the World Bank as being the share prosperity leg or part of that structure, and guaranteeing that you continue to have a liberal development being offered as an alternative to other types of development. So that system very quickly changed from monetary stability for all the nations to a system where the dollar guaranteed soft power for the United States, and guaranteeing that they would be in the center of the monetary arrangements in the world. And the World Bank became much more, rather than being a pillar of shared prosperity, it became a pillar of selling a very specific type of development. I mean, an engagement of developing countries with developed nations, particularly after the decolonization of many countries around the world. The need to create a bond that were beyond just shared prosperity was extremely strong. And the World Bank had a role at the same time at guaranteeing some flows of money into those countries, but assuring that those countries would have policies and will have development paths which enhance the bonds of them with the Western countries. So this is the source of asymmetries, and the symmetries that you have prevail throughout this 50 years are pretty much rooted in this, and the resistance for changes of changing the way the international financial architecture and the international multilateral architecture is pretty much related to maintaining this asymmetries. And if you look at the reforms that the World Bank went through, the resistance to change the governance structure has to do with the need of controlling, in a way, the way the shared prosperity is, or the development perspective is, and the narrative is held by developed nations, I said. So here we are. And I think that those asymmetries became more and more acute. The level of defense against reforms became even stronger because the asymmetries became largely unsustainable. Unsustainable first because of the emergence of different economic powers. That happened before with Europe when they rebuilt and they stopped questioning the system and say, hey, we want you to have a part of the system. We want you to have control of that system. But of course, when it came to the emergence of the emerging market economies, that became even stronger. So, and it became a little bit, if I may say that, I was part of the beast for many years. I was, as you mentioned, I was an executive director at the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank altogether 11 years. And I saw all the discussions about the reforms, and it became even a little bit pathetic, the resistance that you found in sharing governance, because they knew that if you don't share prosperity per se, continuously, the only way to hold the asymmetries was imposing or vetoing the changes in the governance. So as they became more unsustainable, we come all the way. Of course, most of the problems that were addressed by these systems came from developing countries. So why? Developing countries here live a world of asymmetry. Every time there was an external shock. So of course, there's some developing countries that due to their own policies, they end up in crisis. But in general, if you look at the history of crisis of developing countries, they often emerge from abrupt changes in policies in developed countries that create waves and crises. And once they are in crisis, they come back to the IMF or the World Bank. And this kind of structure allow for resisting in changes and securing the power structure that the governance reflected. But we came to a situation in 2009, which was, it was the absence of the problems created by these asymmetries, but also the own contradictions of the system within the industrial countries. And that's when you had the 2008-2009 crisis. That's when you had another round of reforms discussions. And of course, at that time, because there was a clear vision, particularly in the United States and in Europe, that you could not solve the problem by themselves. They needed emerging market economies and all the developing countries. There was an opening for discussion until quantitative easing. Quantitative easing, on one day, the US policymakers woke up and said, we can get out of this crisis with no cost. We just use the dollar and stop printing as much as we can. It's quantitative easing. The Europeans, realized that this is the way to go. Of course, China has its own particular flexibilities, but it created, became very clear for all the other participants in the discussions of the reform that symmetries not only will be changed, but the contradictions of the symmetries would be enhanced. And then that process accelerated to the situation that we arrived to then when it came to the pandemic. The pandemic was the first flag saying, this is a global problem, even though there were global issues like poverty, inequality. Climate change was like becoming the real, those are the real global issues that could not be solved individually or by this architecture. The contradictions were coming, and during the pandemic, there was a need for more cooperation, but then the developed nations did not resort to that kind of, they even in this situation, they resisted in changing the governance to address global issues. And this is where we are. I mean, in addition to that, not only the social and economic development issues continue to increase, inequality continue to increase, and Dr. Isaacs had talked about that, became an even bigger problem. And now climate change has become apparent. You can just open the window, you're going to see it out there. And you see that it is impossible to sustain anymore the systems. Now, I only have 2 minutes, so I want to go back to a little bit of opportunities. What this whole process made developing countries see is that investing only in the reforms of the multilateral system is not enough. That's one thing. This is not a change of the multilateral system, hoping that this is going to trickle down to the global south. It's clearly a naive proposition, okay? They will not give up the power of this government and give up their symmetries. The second thing that those countries and the emerging market countries, but also all the developed countries, realize that they have their own institutions, that if they have to solve if they can solve their own problems, working together, and if that in addition gives a little bit of impulse or changes in the multilateral systems, fair enough. And this is where, for instance, you have all the discussions within the BRICS and more recently about monetary arrangements. So we are in a moment and that I believe it is critical, where not only because the symmetries have led us to profound contradictions that are putting in check our whole, we're creating an existential crisis for us, so we put in check the whole global peace and prosperity perspectives. But also it is a moment where developing countries are beginning to realize that perhaps the way to go about it is to look more to the South institutions, see how they can work together, and see by working together how they can even affect those institutions that compound the international financial architecture. So I think there's an opportunity now, but we have to stop looking so much at the South or the North, and we have to make a deeper analysis of how Southern-led institutions can be the pillars for the new international financial architecture. I'll stop here because I think I want to hear the comments, but also the discussion. I really appreciate participating in this, but I want to hear more now than speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rogerio, and thanks, Gilad, for very insightful and provocative interventions. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, perfect. And you've raised a set of fascinating issues, actually, and also highlighted important points of tension. But you've also highlighted lots of opportunities at this point. So it's, of course, impossible to summarize everything that you've said, but I will just capture some of the key highlights and add a couple of issues that I thought is important also for us to look at as we're looking at the future and moving forward. So a key message that I heard clearly from both of you is that the current GFA is no longer fit for purpose. And there is a key importance for a new global financial architecture. That's loud and clear. And there is also a common understanding of the dysfunctionalities. So maybe not invest more time in doing this analysis, but moving forward in terms of what kinds of solutions are we looking at and what kinds of new forms of financial architecture are we looking at. That's more equitable and that's more led by the global South. I also heard messages about multipolarity and the importance of the rising role of China as an alternative source of financing and South-South development cooperation, and also the importance of multipolar currency systems as well in the de-dollarization debate. Overall, we're seeing a new momentum around reimagining more equitable systems of economic governance. And Rogerio has also referred to the importance of not looking or stopping to look at the global North and looking at alternatives in the global South and institutions working together. So these are some of the key highlights that I heard. Of course, the asymmetries and the power imbalance since the start of the Bretton Woods institutions, but also the resistance for reform. And I think this is where we need to focus a little bit about this resistance for change and resistance for reforms. And as people and organizations and multi-stakeholders working in the field and trying to instigate change like what we did with the Plus Fund as a consortium of multi-stakeholders, where are we seeing the opportunities for change? And here I would like to lift up two issues. One is the issue of recentering the public good. I believe I've heard this from both of you, but again, with such resistance, how do we capitalize on the current moment and the multiple crises to center the notion of the public good? How do we shift the narrative? I think, Rogerio, you talked about the narrative and conservative narrative, trying to maintain the status quo for the interests of certain groups. So how do we shift this narrative from a free market to global public investment to the public good? And the second point is recentering politics in the economy as well. Like how do we shift power? And particularly if we're trying to build up a bottom-up pressure for change, where do we see the openings? Where do we see the leverage points for engagement? And which global spaces should we target? So these are some of the questions that I'm grappling with in general, but also having listened to both of you. And I just thought I would put them forward as we open the floor for the conversation and also hear from our participants. I suggest that we take 2 rounds of questions. So maybe start by 3 or 4 questions, turn it back to Gilad and Rogerio for feedback, and then start another round of questions when possible. Yes, so I already have a question on, can the panelists please elaborate on fleshing out the global public good? So can we take 2 more questions, please, and then let our panelists respond? People, please feel free to unmute and come in if you would like to speak and to put your question. Otherwise, put it in the chat, please.
Ask a question. It's just a language issue that I'm not a native speaker of English. What did Chi meant by flashing out global public good?
Yeah, my understanding of the question, and definitely Siwi can add to this, but how do you unpack, how do you explain the whole notion of the global public good in light of your presentations? I mean, how would you center the issue of the global public good in this conversation? Any other questions that we have so far before turning it back to our panelists? Okay, over to both of you. Mm-hmm.
Well, Gilad, would you like to go first?
No, you can go. Up to you.
Well, if I understood the question, and I think it's a very good question. I think let me tell you how I translated the question. Okay, what are the global challenges that you have, and how can you address them? Something in that sort. Please, if I'm pronouncing it right, Chi, give a thumbs up if that's the question that you wanted to ask. Excellent. Okay. I think that we have 2 major global bads that we have to address urgently. One, which I continue to think is the root of all other problems, which is inequality. Inequality, and it has always been, the problem is not just a moral issue. It's also a moral issue. It should be enough to address it, but it's also an economic issue of the capacity of the system that we live to survive. I mean, you cannot have a long-term sustainable market economy or any economy if you continue to count on very few people to benefit from that. And it's a political and a geopolitical problem. And this is becoming, since the 2009 crisis, inequality has expanded so significantly. We're going backwards. And I think it has become an inequality emergency. The second one, which is related to that, is climate change. Climate change, and it would take much longer for me to elaborate on this, but I think you have the feeling that when you have a concentration of consumption based on fossil fuels in a very small group of countries and people that overtake and use the energy that is driving us to the climate emergency, you can see how the 2 are related. So we need to reform. We have to think of changes in equality at the same time thinking about the transition in energy, but also other types of consumptions that are not sustainable. So I think those are the key issues that we need to address. Now, having said that, let's go back to the discussion of the reforms, and I'll be very succinct here. I'm sorry, maybe too succinct, but I want to say, I think there is an opportunity for the South with their own institutions to promote a new narrative and project this narrative with actions. The first step that we have to take, and this is what I think we need to dedicate more time to understanding the Southern institutions, but also talking to the Southern institutions. Let's look at the BRICS banks and the new arrangements, but also all the arrangements, South-South arrangements of the world. We have to, instead of coming back over and over again, having a discussion of reform of the World Bank or the IMF, we should go to this institution and say, what do we learn from the mistakes made in the previous arrangements? How can you, if for instance, China can be a source of good in terms of shared prosperity and monetary arrangements that are going to be stability and shared prosperity, as I said, to be repeated. But they can go back into the same mistake. Look at the discussions of monetary arrangements. When the BRICS are talking about having a single currency for trade and finance among them, having financial integration and so on. The Chinese are talking about having the yuan as the center of the universe, okay? This is a mistake 1.0, and we do not have time for mistakes. We don't have time for mistakes because inequality and the climate emergency are right in front of our faces, and this is leading to existential problems. So bottom line, global goods, inequality, equality and reversing climate change. Second, how to address that through South-South cooperation. Third, most importantly, let's keep talking to our colleagues in the South to say, do not repeat the same mistakes. So sorry, I took too much time, but that's what I wanted to share with you.
Thank you, Rogerio. Gilad, anything to add here before we move to the second question? Yes.
Thanks, and I'll respond also to some others that I've seen, if that's okay, Kara. So I think that I'd like to start with Vishwas asked a question, which I think is quite pertinent. I see that he's left, unfortunately, but the end part of his question is, what makes change possible now, and what's different today? And I think that's something which we've spoken about with our collective. Yes, the global financial architecture has been inequitable in some of the same ways, in some other ways too, for the last 40 years, and some of the same things which we're saying now have been said previously, right? So what's different, and what can we do which is different also? And I don't that's a question which I really think we collectively within this world, those of us engaged on this issue, need to come together and speak about. I think the conjuncture, and this builds on points which have just been made, so I won't go into them again by you guys, but the conjuncture is different. One difference is multipolarity. You didn't have other meaningful poles of global financial influence for the last 30 years. The sort of extreme nature of these crises now, the existential issue of a climate crisis, and this is not separate. Climate finance is an integral piece of the global financial architecture, and if we're going to get climate solutions right, we have to get climate finance right, and if we need to get climate finance right, that's only possible within a reformed global financial architecture. So the climate crisis calls on us in that way. And then I think it is important for us to look for alignments between global north and south actors within our countries, labor movements, and so on. And the manner in which the global financial architecture disadvantages global north non-elites is also a very important point of convergence. Just to note that in the on a global public good, there's also a narrower way in which that term is used, which is an actual good which is used globally, and the US dollar is sometimes referred to, or that there should be a currency serving the purpose of a global public good. That's also how that term is used. Veronica asked a really useful question, and people can look in the Q&A about that, which is whether the new layers in the architecture occurred as a result of COVID. My response is that I'm not sure that it called forth, novel instruments, but it did result in certain things being implemented, okay, including rapid financing, including the SDRs being used for linked to a social need, and including a reformulating of policy approaches in global north countries. The kind of stimuluses which we saw have broken with economic orthodoxies. Of course, what we've also seen is a re-entrenchment of those orthodoxies in austerity and in global south countries. But the global north, has quite profoundly broken with certain dominant conservative logics. And so there are opportunities, I think, which that raises. There was, sorry, so I don't have to come in again. Then there was one last question on de-dollarization, and if there's an enabling environment and what this means. It's highly contentious. There's different camps, which the one camp says, it's often linked to kind of Harvard economists and so on, says that the overwhelming majority of payments still take place in dollars, and that there are structural features which make de-dollarization unlikely, okay? For instance, the availability and stability of an alternative, okay, right? I think on the counter to that, this is playing out in real time, where this is actually being used, and historically there's no permanence to like global currency, and so I would say for our purposes it's certainly a thread which we need to push on, but to do so cautiously or deliberately in terms of what we would want to set up as an alternative, as has already been alluded to.
Thank you, Gilad and Rogerio. And just again, a follow-up question, because as we're talking about the rising momentum, we're seeing some opportunities. Some people were asking what makes this a unique moment. Again, as practitioners, as multi-stakeholders, as activists, where are the spaces, and I'm referring here to your experience in the Plus Fund as well as a consortium, where are you seeing the entry points and the leverage points? And which global spaces people need to be engaging in now, as opposed to the spring meetings of the World Bank and the IMF, and as Dr. Rogerio reminded us, shift away from the traditional and usual conversations. So what kind of shifts are we talking about, and how are we building this bottom-up pressure, which I believe is very, very important for the next phase?
Yeah. Gada, I think it's a really crucial question, and I agree that there is some well-worn types of proposals and advocacy, which I don't think we should stop making. For instance, the reform of IFI governance, okay, but which we should also know what else we can do and what the limitations of those are. I see two important spaces. The first, which Rogerio's already mentioned, is in global South spaces, such as the new development bank, in BRICS, and so on. Now, it's complicated because some of these spaces are dominated by regimes which also have dubious elements, whether that's Russia, which is dubious in many ways, or sort of China's autocratic elements and so on. So there's no angels in this process. Brazil obviously is a much more progressive actor. But if you look, for instance, and Rogerio is more of an expert on this than I am. But if you look at the manner in which the new development bank is acting, there are question marks, but in share ownership and therefore in voice, in speed of lending, in decisions not to have policy conditionalities, and in decisions to lend not only in US dollars, but in local currency, all of those shake up the existing trends within multilateral development finance institutions like the World Bank, and we, I think, need to uphold those and cement the positive elements, while still, there's still oversight, gender, environmental concerns around certain lending practices and so on. But certainly in global South forums, I do think, though, there are multilateral forums which are also very important outside of the sort of Bretton Woods institutions. And the UN Global Tax impetus, I think, is an example of how a multilateral forum like the UN, with all of its limitations and bureaucracy and so on, is a much more democratic space than the sort of OECD, G7, Bretton Woods institutions, and so on. We need that in particular in climate financing. A very worrying trend, which South Africa's JETP, this climate financing, illustrates, is a bilateral approach where a consortium of global North donors engage with a global South country. Now that's going to recreate the same problem. So there are UN and other climate financing, not conventions, but standards, norms, a lot of which are being ignored. But we need to cement, for instance, a real multilateral climate finance institutions. So both on the level of Global South entry points, but there are, important entry points on a multilateral level. I'm convinced that the Bretton Woods institutions are reformable in the ways that we would like, but of course that's not a fight I think we should stop fighting.
Well, thank you, Gilad. I would like to turn it back to Dr. Rogerio here for responding to David's question. I guess you can see the question, Dr. Rogerio.
Yeah, let me see, David, we have lending to countries. Yeah, that's a interesting, all questions have been interesting, and comments made by Gilad too. See, this is what we have seen in the recent history is this. I mean, changes are made in the way these institutions operate when there's a crisis that knocks at the doors of the G7 and so on. And of course, there's one crisis that is the inequality was knocking at the door slightly. There was a moral issue about that. Oh yeah, there's some poor people around that. When it becomes a geopolitical question, then it's got banging at the door and say, hey, it becomes very loud. Pandemic, when you had a global health issue, is something that is knocking very heavily at all the doors. Climate change is not yet there, but it's getting there very quickly. And I think that the South already knows all this global goods or global issues already inside the houses of those in the North. They see that every day. They open the window and see it. They see in pollution, they see in droughts, they see in fires, they see in people not having access to water, sanitation, girls not being able to study because of not having access to proper infrastructure. Name it, they're all being there. So I think that unfortunately, if we wait for the reforms of the Bretton Woods institutions, we will have to wait for a great bang at the door, something really big, a tragedy. And there's some of them already happening, but happening inside those countries to make them wake up. I don't think we should not wish for it. We should not wait for that. The idea that there will be a reform and that therefore the reform will provide more for climate finance. Climate finance nowadays is just a drop of water in terms of the mobilization of resources that you need to address inequality and climate events in developing countries. What we need to realize is there's enormous capacity to mobilize resources within the South. I'm not talking about the big emerging markets, but even in smaller ones, and that we have to unleash that capacity somehow on the fiscal side, for instance, but also tapping the resources available in the southern country. But that's a longer conversation. The point that I'm trying to make here is that I open the newspaper and I open the journals. I can read 1,000 articles and reports about how the World Bank and the IMF have changed. If I read one about the New Development Bank or the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or other development banks, national banks, I'm going to be thrilled. We need, I ask you, how many articles have you been reading about triangular cooperations within Southern development banks or the arrangements in the South? In the proportions minimal. We are looking at the wrong place and we having the conversations with the wrong people. We should be talking to those, for instance, the NDB, saying you have to widen the membership. You have to look at the mistakes that the World Bank has done in the past and not reproduce their mistakes. You have to collaborate. You have to have business models that collaborate with Southern banks in a completely different way from the way the World Bank and other Western banks. This is the kind of conversation. To be very frank with you, and I'll stop here, we are talking with the wrong actors. Not that we don't have to talk with the World Bank, we should. We should expect even that talking among us more will lead the World Bank to change even faster. Because otherwise, if you look at the proposals for the reform of the World Bank, this is more of the same thing. And now trying to use the World Bank to do more climate finance that the G7 is not doing. They're not putting enough money in climate change, which is minimal, $100 billion. And now we say, oh, the World Bank will do it. We're going to reform it. No, we have to talk to the right actors. We have to do more studies and talk among ourselves about how those actors can collaborate. We have to rethink the international financial architecture from south to north, but particularly starting with the conversation to the south. Sorry, I could go on and on this. I got a little bit excited about this conversation, and I hope I didn't take too much time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We basically have 1 minute. So we had one more question, but if one of you can
I apologize for
brief,
that.
I know
I
that's
took too
okay.
much time.
If Gilad, you can be very brief. The question is about, and before we wrap up, is about the prospects for civil society. Like, where are we seeing the openings? Where are we seeing the closures, particularly in light of the closure of the civic space and the various threats that we're seeing to happening to human rights defenders and working on issues of climate, but also working on other issues. So if you can do this in 1 minute and we wrap up, that would be great. Thank you.
You'll get it in a minute. I'll just say one thing then, which is to say that I think there's a huge sense of alliance building, which I feel a lot of organizations across countries and across organizational spheres and across silos, which are engaging with one another. And I think that's one example of a positive opening at the moment, as well as an engagement with a conceptual framework, for instance, a rights-based approach, but in trying to form collectively what it means to advance alternatives. There are other answers to that, but in a minute.
I'm sure. Thank you. Thank you so much for our panelists, for SCIS, and for our very active participants, and thanks for a very engaged conversation. So thank you so much.